The latest news and talk, hot, fresh, and delivered when you want it. Power 98.7. Now we're talking.
Right, South Africa's just released its updated National Climate Plan, which is a draft blueprint for cutting emissions and protecting vulnerable communities from the rising toll of extreme weather. If you're living in Gauteng, you would have experienced some of those increasingly intense storms in recent years. We saw the devastating floods in KZN in 2021, in Eastern Cape and Western Cape more recently, heat waves in the Northern Cape as well, and the sudden snow on Van Riemen's Pass last year. Climate change is a dangerous reality that South Africa is facing. We speak now to Louise Nordia, who's a climate expert at the World Wildlife Fund and a member of the Presidential Climate Commission. Thanks so much for joining us, Louise, for this important conversation.
And thank you for having me.
Great. Let's start with the context of the draft climate plan that's been released by government and the urgency now for South Africa to update its climate targets.
So there is an international requirement that every 5 years, countries who have signed onto this global agreement called the Paris Agreement, that every 5 years, countries submit this document called their nationally determined contribution. But in my thinking, actually, that's not the urgency of it. The urgency of it is the science. And, everybody must understand that every ton of greenhouse gas emissions that we put out into the atmosphere anywhere in the world drives the climate changes that we are seeing. And the urgency of this matter, because I think people don't know this piece, Tehillah. The urgency is that the scientists have told us that there is points at which the amount of emissions we pump out there clicks us over into different temperature scenarios. So, for trying to hold global warming below 1.5 degrees, which is what the Paris Agreement speaks of, we have it's called a global carbon budget, a global amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we can emit before we click over that temperature goal.
Right.
And, they've also told us how once we're over the 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're into much worse impacts on people. And really, I think for the Climate Commission, our major concern is the workers that will be affected either by climate change impacts or by the transition to a low-carbon economy, and the poor in this country. Because, those of us that are middle class and wealthy, we have the financial resources to cope in one way or another. But, it's people on the ground that don't have that. And so we really have to try urgently to keep these emissions below the 1.5 level. And the global carbon budget, we've already used up 86% of it. No, not 89. So
is that South Africa or that's globally?
No, that's the globe. And, if we continue at the current level of emissions, we will have used that all up by 2030. So that's 6 years' time, or 5 years' time, actually, 5.5.
Yeah.
So, that's the urgency. That's the real urgency.
The draft plan by South Africa also mentions the need for fairness. Of course, there's been a lot of reporting on the fact that Donald Trump, in his first day in office, removed the United States from the Paris Agreement. South Africa is a middle-income country. Our emissions are we're still trying to develop our industries as well. How can South Africa have fair climate targets while still trying to grow our industries?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because that really is the heart of the matter. So part of the Paris Agreement is this principle, it's called We have a lot of jargon in the climate world, but okay, this one is called...
It's good to
common
demystify it.
Yeah. The common but differentiated responsibility principle. So it's very clear that, it's the so-called developed countries, because I'd rather live in South Africa, the so-called developed countries that have caused this climate problem off the back of their industrialization based on coal and fossil fuels. South Africa is only 1% of the problem. So, what we do in our country can only help with that 1% of emissions. But we're in a geopolitical situation where, some countries are not playing fair. It is very clear that every single country must do its fair share. Developed countries are supposed to do more mitigation, because mitigation meaning reducing their emissions, because they're the bigger part of the problem. And they are also supposed to give money and other support to countries like ourselves, which, have not historically caused the greater part of the problem.
Right.
But we must still do our fair share. If anyone like the US is exiting out of the Paris Agreement, they are putting down doing their fair share. It's incumbent on everybody else to continue and do our fair share. Otherwise, we're really in a hiding to nowhere.
Okay. So to that end, about doing our fair share, we've announced South Africa's keeping its 2030 emission targets the same and adding new 2035 targets. Are these strong enough in your opinion?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question, because it depends who you ask. So let me sketch for you a little bit of the domestic landscape around this. So, if I was a business where my business model was a fossil fuel business of some or other kind, I would be responding exactly as those businesses are responding. They are saying, slow down, do less, do it later, don't punish us. Because they need time and emission space to address their assets in their balance sheet. Some of these assets, for example, might be coal that's in the ground. They've paid for that, they've invested in that, and they want to realize value off that. And so on. Labor in the space is saying, we understand that there have to be ambitious emissions reductions, but that can't happen without looking after the workers who, off the back of those workers, we built our economy.
We're just struggling to hear you, Louise. I'm just going to ask you to maybe just take a step so that we can hear you better.
Like
Perfect.
this?
Yeah, great.
Okay. So, the Labour is saying, yes, let's move on emission reductions, but we must take care of a justice in the transition. We can't leave these workers stranded. We can't have ghost towns and people have no jobs and so on, especially in our country where unemployment is so high.
Right.
And then there are businesses in other sectors. So every single sector is going to be affected by either or both climate changes. Your supply chain might be affected by the kind of floods we've seen. If in agriculture, your workers might not be able to work in the heat of the day. Or you might be a business that's exposed to the kind of carbon border levies that other countries are putting in place, and so on. So every business is going to be exposed to climate changes and also to these transition risks. Not moving fast enough or moving too fast, etc. So it really depends who you talk to. If you ask me, then I will tell you that the Climate Commission commissioned some technical modeling.
Right.
And we feel, well, I can't say we because the Commission is still debating this, but certainly the technical work we commissioned shows that the targets in DFFE's draft are not ambitious enough. In other words, that, we're promising too high. And I must tell you that we're promising.
Okay, Louise, unfortunately, we've lost you there for a moment. Okay.
And now?
Louise, I think we're going to have to leave it there. We'll just have to take the conversation and talk now to Professor, still focusing on climate, still focusing on South Africa's updated plan. We'll speak now to Professor Samson Mapweli, who's the head of the South African National Energy Development Institute. We just spoke to Louise Nodia, who's a climate expert at the World Wildlife Fund. Very good evening, Prof. Great to have you on the show.
Good evening to you and the listeners.
Let's continue talking about the National Draft Plan, and let's speak then about SANEDI. As I understand, that's the acronym for the Institute, with the public comment closing at the end of the month. How will the mandatory carbon budget and mitigation plans practically affect major emitters like Eskom, Sasol, ArcelorMittal as well?
Yeah, so there's quite a number of what we call listed activities that are declared in terms of Section 26, subsection 2 of the Act, and those activities go beyond electricity production from fossil fuels. It's quite a lot of activities where you get carbon dioxide or CO2 equivalent gases that are classified as greenhouse gases coming out of the various processes. So what needs to happen is that the companies or various entities that are involved in the listed activities, they are called the data providers in terms of the draft plan. They need to provide the data, and then they need to be given what we call the carbon budget. Basically, the highest levels of emissions that they are allowed to have within a particular period of time. And there's a list of greenhouse gases that have been declared in terms of the law. That list is also part of Annexure 1 of the draft document. Now, how the draft document affects their activities, including Eskom, Sasol, and others that are known to be large consumers, large emitters, is that they need to then have specific carbon budgets that are determined through a formula. And then they need to have mitigation measures in place, and they don't have to exceed those emission budget or carbon budgets that they will be given by the DFFE.
Okay, the regulations that have been published for draft comment include punitive measures such as hefty fines for non-compliance. Do you think that the enforcement of these measures is practical and possible?
It is very practical and possible. For instance, if a company is found to have gone or beyond the carbon budgets that they would have been given, if they exceed that, the penalties could be a 5 million rand fine for the first time, or 5 years imprisonment of the respective authorities in the particular company. On second or subsequent conviction, they can be fined about close to 10 million rands or imprisonment not exceeding a period of 10 years. That is very, very enforceable, and it's a realistic kind of a target. We know, for example, that in the electricity generation sector, where many people focus, Eskom, when they realize that they might exceed some of the targets that their carbon budget, they then have to apply from the competent authority, which is the Minister of DFFE, for the minister to basically allow them to go beyond above those carbon budgets. And that application is simply because the ESCOM board and the ESCOM executives don't want to find themselves having to face these kind of penalties. So it works. And it's good for awareness as well. So for the various companies that are involved in the activities that are listed in Annexure 2 of the draft document.
How do you think these regulations will impact investment decisions in the long term?
These regulations always impact investment decisions. First, the impact on the positive side of things, because we know that the world is moving towards a net zero. We have very few countries, countries like America that don't believe in climate change and things like that. But the rest of the world is moving towards a net zero kind of a situation. So many countries or many investors, they look at this kind of draft documents, and then they see they see investment opportunities in the low carbon economy, because there's quite a lot of opportunities that come with the low carbon economy. Investment in the renewable energy sector, for instance, investment in low carbon emission technologies. We have technologies that still burn fossil fuels but emit less than the other technologies. So those are investment opportunities that the world kind of see. To give an example, in the renewable energy sector in South Africa, we've got an investment of more than 200 billion rand. And we are expecting an investment of close to 300 billion rand in the production of green hydrogen only. So those are the opportunities that come with this kind of draft documents.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how there's policy certainty, and that creates an entire pipeline of investment. Just finally, before we let you go, what kind of support or incentives might be necessary to help high-emitting sectors transition in a just way? Because we talk always about a just transition.
Yeah, they need to be assisted in terms of incentives, such as your carbon. We have the carbon tax. We need to introduce, so to speak, a mechanism where the entities that reduce their emissions can then be incentivized. In the past, we had what we call the energy efficiency program that ESCOM ran. It was also ran by SANEDI at some point, where when you introduce energy efficiency measures, ESCOM and government will come in and assist you by giving you an incentive that will basically reduce the cost of the activity that you are engaging in, that will result in lower emissions. Those are the kind of incentives that we need. Also, the tax incentives, for instance, we have that in the building sector that is run through the National Treasury. SANEDI is involved in terms of managing the database and things like that. Those are the kind of things that I would like to see going forward, to encourage businesses to partake in lowering their emissions and adhering to their carbon budget as determined by the department.
Right, thanks so much. That's Professor Samson Mampweli, who is the head of the Energy Secretariat. And I'm going to try to say this fast, the South African National Development Energy Institute, also known as SANEDI. And we were just talking about the climate index and the draft plan that's open for public comment until the 29th of August.